On today's episode of the Unveil podcast, I chat to Dr. Jenny Wade. Jenny is a multidisciplinary professional whose career has spanned diverse areas with an emphasis on higher values that produce real-world results, especially the realization of human potential individually and collectively. Dr. Wade is a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, San Francisco, a researcher, organization and leadership development consultant, and developmental psychologist specializing in the structuring of consciousness in normal and non-ordinary states and related transformative processes. And I'm going to leave that stumble in because honestly, this podcast is a great one for understanding consciousness, and that's a big topic. And so Dr. Jenny and I talk about the different states of consciousness and how we can work with conflict resolution simply by understanding that the other party may not be in the same status of consciousness as you. And that's not a better, worse, an evolved, a less evolved. That's just seeing the world in a different way. We also talk about non-ordinary states of consciousness, so altered states of consciousness and higher states of consciousness. And we discuss a big part of her work, which is preconception sentience and also accessing altered states of consciousness during peak experiences of sex. We go quite in depth into all of that, and we talk about post-death near-death experience consciousness as well. This is a real exploration of parapsychology, the things that we can't really explain. And I do try to ask Jenny, where is this field of science going? This is a great podcast for anyone interested in just understanding more about the complexity and the miracle that it is to be a human being with consciousness. Without further ado, here we go. Here's my Unveil podcast interview with Dr. Jenny Wade. Jenny, it is so wonderful to have you on the Unveil podcast.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I have no idea where this conversation today is going to go. I feel like some of that is because of your field of work. So we'll start, as I always do, with just giving our listeners the 30,000-foot view of who you are and, as I like to say, how you serve.
Okay. Well, I've had a number of different careers. I started out in market communications and then went into leadership and organization development. And I'm currently a researcher in transpersonal psychology. My specialty is consciousness studies, particularly how consciousness is structured under different conditions. And I wrote a developmental theory on the evolution of personal consciousness from prior to birth, when we have people's very first memories of coming into this life, through near-death experiences where we can validate what people are beginning to experience as they die. Mm-hmm. And so that looking at consciousness and the way it changes took me into adult development, which I used a lot in my leadership consulting and organization consulting to help people work better and to optimize the talent that was in organizations, and also to minimize conflict. People are actually existing, the majority of people walking around as adults are existing in three distinct realities based on what they can perceive, the kind of consciousness that they have. And we're talking about normal adults and normal waking consciousness. So these different realities, though, operate on a different kind of time. They have different kind of relationships that exist among the entities that are perceived in that reality and so forth. And so to be effective with a wide range of people, you need to understand the reality that they're living in and how yours may differ, and be able to translate effectively from your reality into theirs. So that was my sort of straight corporate career. In looking at this, though, of course, I got interested in what you might want to call higher or more esoteric states of consciousness, the kind that are reached through meditation, martial arts, or other spiritual techniques that cultivate consciousness in particular ways. And after I did that research, I became interested in the altered states, particularly ecstatic states, that are triggered by sex. And so that was another huge piece of my career, was investigating things like that, because they happen quite frequently, and most people don't know what to do with them. They're
Mhm.
confused by these states because nobody's ever said that this happens,
Mm.
and it can be very uh, disruptive for people who aren't expecting something like that. So,
Mm.
my research helped normalize these kinds of states, although still many people don't know about them.
Right.
And then since then, I have also been researching an altered state that provides really enhanced human capabilities called battle trance. And it is something that happens to many people when they feel threatened or when the group that they're a part of, like their buddies in a combat situation, feel threatened. And
Mm.
warriors in ancient cultures used to know how to cultivate this state and cultivated it very deliberately
Mm.
before they went into battle with other people. But it gives people really superhuman capabilities for a restricted amount of time that
Mm.
enable them to perform amazingly heroic feats.
Mm.
And then since then, I've been doing research in other areas that doesn't have to do with consciousness studies, looking for an astronomical key to most of the pagan religions that existed in Europe um, in the ancient world. So that's kind of a brief overview. And
Right.
what
And
I've
now my listeners understand why there's so many directions that this conversation could go in. Because when somebody studies consciousness, it's like you're studying, well, actually, let's define some of these terms because consciousness is sometimes difficult to describe. What is consciousness? So, can we start with the real basics? And I suppose I mean just normal human awake consciousness. What is that? What makes that?
Well, philosophers, religions, and certainly modern psychology have attempted to define consciousness. And I think one of the best short definitions I ever came across was one by Richard Restak, who's a neuroscientist, who said that consciousness is the interface between the internalized maps we make of the world and the world that we perceive through our senses. So we're
Mm.
always negotiating that boundary and we're always comparing and updating what our interior model of reality is with what the reality is that we're actually faced with.
Mhm.
So
Mm.
consciousness is there and it's characterized or defined clinically by how we experience time, how we experience space, and how we experience personal agency.
Mm.
Um, and by that, I mean the ability to affect the environment.
Mm.
So, and a lot of this is very culturally determined in terms of what's believed to be normal for
Right.
adults or for children at certain ages.
Mm.
So, in Western culture, for example, if you have a brain injury and you go into an emergency room, one of the first series of questions they ask you is, "Do you know what day it is? Do you know where you are?" So we have time and space being checked right there. And then often the healthcare practitioner will say, "How many fingers am I holding up?" And that's you have to be able to process that it's not you holding up the fingers, it's someone else holding up fingers, and that they're capable of holding them up. The fingers belong to them and they can move the fingers or change how many they are showing.
Mm.
So, those are attributes of agency.
Mm. Mhm.
And in our culture, for example, adults don't attribute agency or the ability to influence things to inanimate objects. We make a real distinction between inanimate and animate.
Mm.
And there's some things that are sort of in the gray area, like
Mhm.
plants or
Mhm.
viruses or something. Mm. So, those are ways to think about consciousness. And consciousness is a function of memory because the only way you can compare what you have in your subjective experience and what you can experience with your senses is you have to hold something there in memory long enough to make the comparison. So,
Mhm.
those are
Mhm.
really the four features of consciousness and what we study. And those change over time or over development from being fairly simple representations to becoming increasingly complex.
Okay. And so what's happening in altered states of consciousness? How do those functions change? Where do those four things differ?
Well, they change from the consensus reality of the culture that you belong to.
Got it.
When people ask you, what day is it, or who's president right now, or something like that in an ER, if you answer those questions incorrectly, you're considered to be altered in some way. And
Mhm.
in an emergency room situation, you're considered to have an injury or some kind of pathology
Mm,
or trauma to your
mm,
brain.
got it.
If developmentally, over time, if you don't reach the milestones that your culture agrees should be the consciousness of a 12-year-old,
Mhm.
then you're considered mentally handicapped or retarded. The word retarded means slow. You are slow to reach the developmental milestones that are considered normal
Yeah.
or held by the majority of people your age
Mm,
in your culture. So, an
mhm.
altered state is just when your reality perception, your consciousness differs from that of the majority of people who are awake and considered normal.
Right.
You're
And you
becoming
mentioned earlier
conscious
that
now.
like human adults are in three different states, three different areas with their consciousness. I'd love for you to explain some of this because conflict resolution is something that's fundamental to us all. And it seems really obvious that if someone is perceiving reality in a different way, you're going to come to conflict. So I'd really love to dig in there if that's possible.
Sure. Well, there are actually six different stages that we
Mhm.
see with normal adults. And they change depending on what you can see. In the earlier two stages, people are not aware that other individuals have their own unique point of view.
Mm,
They don't discern that you sitting there in your office with a white background behind you are not experiencing the same thing that I here in my office with these bookshelves behind me is experiencing.
right.
So people just they don't have that awareness and they are unaware that other people have different emotional reactions. So people in these stages just don't understand. Some consultant friends of mine were doing a program in a company and working with some engineers. And this one engineer, now this is a man with an advanced college degree and everything,
Mm, mhm.
and we're doing empathy exercises. And the exercise was, well, with how would you imagine someone would feel if this and this happened to them? And he couldn't do the exercise and couldn't do the exercise and couldn't do the exercise. And finally, one of the consultants, you couldn't get away with this today, one of the consultants came up and just tapped him lightly on the back of the head and said, well, now, if I did that to you, but much harder, how would you feel? And he said, well, it hurts and I'd be angry with you. And she said, okay. So what if I did the same thing and she did it to the person sitting across from him? What if I did it to her? How's she feeling? I don't know. This man really could not extrapolate to understand that someone else might have either different or the same feelings that he would in certain conditions.
Wow.
So it's an area for lots of misunderstanding
Right.
that
Yeah.
leads to conflict.
Hmm.
And in more the middle range, a lot of it is a difference in values and attention. Um, in one of these realities, people fundamentally believe, and believe me, all of us have all of these inside of us. It's not
Hmm.
like we don't all have access to all these different states of consciousness. We
Hmm.
all do, and we shift in and out of these states without even realizing it during the day.
Hmm.
So, one of the main ones that most people have in most societies globally is the belief that life is fair. And
Mm,
so people are disturbed when bad people seem to get away with
mhm,
heinous acts
mm,
and good people never seem to get ahead or they're
mm,
taken advantage of
mhm,
by these bad people who are never called into account for
mm,
what they've done. And we're outraged when we see this happen.
mm,
Why do and it was a title of a book published some years ago. Why do good bad things happen to good people?
mm,
This is a key area in religious studies and philosophy. It's
Mm.
not enough to live a good life. You can still be shafted
Mm.
by circumstances or by
Yes.
other individuals.
Right.
And then in another one of these realities, that kind of good and bad, knowing what the rules are, is not important. In this other reality, it's understanding those rules so you can use them to take advantage and get ahead of other people. It's a more
Hmm.
competitive mindset. And
Mm.
so you're willing to use those rules to give yourself an advantage, to increase the odds that you'll get what you want. And in that reality, it's not about good and bad. In that reality, it's about winners and losers.
Mm.
Are
Mhm.
you going to win? Are you going to have more advantage, more status, more whatever the goodies are than
Mhm.
other people? And do other people recognize you for that? Does
Mm.
everybody know that you're kind of, on top and
Mhm.
they're not quite as good?
Mm.
And then another one of these realities, both of those are not important. What's important is belonging in close, harmonious relationships.
Mm.
So in that
Mhm.
reality, it's all about belonging to a set of intimate friends
Mm.
where you all have those same values
Yeah.
and share them.
Mm.
And in that reality, it's sort of about love conquers all. If we
Mm.
all understand enough about each other, we will come to consensus and agree about how to go forward in a concerted way.
Mm.
And the reality is, of course, that that doesn't work for a lot of other people. People
Right.
have divergent points of view. They just
Yeah.
don't believe that. And
Mhm.
that reality does not perceive or is threatened by meaningful differences between people.
Right.
They
Mhm.
don't want to see that some people have more talent in this area and not as much in this area. They really want to perceive everybody as being the same.
Mhm.
So that reality has a lot of conflict with the other two, where judgments are made and differentials are
Mm.
stressed.
Mhm.
And then the sort of most complex one of these realities actually merges the last two that I spoke about and perceives that, yeah, you can love people and have a lot of respect for people in relationships, but you can also be outcome driven. And
Mhm.
the most important thing in that particular reality is for a person to realize their greatest potential or their fulfill their mission or purpose on earth. It's a
Mhm.
very existentially oriented mindset that is looking for the meaning of things, for the meaning of life, and um, achieving that, but not with status symbols. They don't care about status symbols.
Right.
They care about relationships and they'll never sacrifice relationships to get a particular outcome.
Mm.
But their life, they're not controlled by how people feel about them. So
Yeah.
they're willing to be disliked,
Mm.
just because, hey, not everybody likes me or not everybody likes everybody else. That's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, I mean, when you describe them, it's like, it's so obvious how, if you're approaching life from one of these perspectives in one dimension, then it's going to butt up against the complete conflict from someone else's point of view.
Yes, that's right.
Hmm.
That's
Interesting. So I am going to go into all of the other details when you're talking about higher states of consciousness as well, but I'd really like to just intersperse some of this kind of science stuff with how you got here. So how did you get to studying transpersonal psychology and consciousness from starting kind of marketing? What was the thread?
uh, that I was working with so many people in, let's say, the same organization who wanted the same ends. They had a new product they wanted to launch, or they were developing a new product, and they saw it from completely different perspectives.
Mm.
And the engineers, for example, thought it was totally appropriate to communicate with customers about, like every single nut and bolt or technical advancement in the thing. Like, well, we'd just tell them we've got, titanium X and, milled to a certain tolerance. They thought that would sell the product. Well, it won't. The customer is wanting, tell me how I can make more money, have a more profitable
Yeah.
business, satisfy my customers better. That's what they wanted to hear. They didn't care about the nuts and bolts, or only
Yeah.
about the nuts and bolts as it would give them some kind of advantage with their end users.
Mm-hmm.
And the engineers were up against the manufacturing people who said, don't make those kinds of promises because we can't do this, this, and this. You've got to really dial it back.
Yeah.
And the marketing and sales people were willing to promise the moon to people, just sale. So we had all these conflicting points of view, and that's
Yeah.
what got me interested because everybody's worldview was valid. There was
Yeah.
nothing wrong with any one of these approaches or ways of perceiving what was going on. And so I just got curious about, we're all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to manufacture high quality products that we can sell to people who will use them to their own advantage, to make things better for themselves and better for the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we couldn't agree at all. So I became interested in how these different people perceived things and what they were focusing on, what was in their reality versus the reality of someone else who was trying to achieve the same end. So
Mm.
that's how
And
it
I mean,
all.
it's kind of logical, like when you're thinking of like, you need to understand how someone else is thinking in order to sell to what their thought process is.
Right. And so the sales and marketing people got that to an extent, but they only got it with their customers. They didn't take those same skills and bring them back home to work with the engineers.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of all outward facing rather than working with the team.
Right.
Yes. And so, in terms of your consciousness studies, it kind of feels like you get the lie of the land and then you're looking to those. You mentioned sort of pre-birth. Did you say pre-birth or preconception?
Yes. No, I actually preconception as well, but
Interesting.
that's harder to validate.
Right.
I was looking at third party validated data,
Mm-hmm.
and fetuses are sentient. They know and they remember things. The field of prenatal psychology is still a very nascent field, and most people don't know about it.
Mm.
And research has been depressed globally because if you can prove or say anything scientifically about a fetus having awareness,
Yeah.
then people use it to legislate against the possibility of abortion
Yeah.
uh, for women. So the research has been badly used and is as a threat of being badly used, the way people's lives have been threatened, who offer abortion services and
Mm.
so forth. And yet, if you look at the whole body of research, people who understand pre and perinatal psychology don't take a stand per se on abortion.
Yeah.
They say do not have any unwanted children
Mm.
because if a child is unwanted, they are aware of that in the
Mm.
womb. And
Mm.
whether you're able to get an abortion, whether you try to get an abortion and it fails for some reason, and
Mm.
you bear the child, um, or you have a child that you never tried to abort it, but you never wanted the child,
Mm-hmm.
you condemn that child and the people around them to really a life of misery and often also to a life of violence.
Mm.
Violence is across the board is lower in societies that permit abortion, so that
Oh,
fewer
wow.
unwanted children are born than when you have unwanted children.
Mm.
And so they're more prone. A child who is unwanted is more prone to early developmental difficulties,
Mm-hmm.
to truancy and other bad behavior in school,
Mm.
to broken relationships, to early addiction, all kinds of addiction, nicotine, alcohol, not just scheduled drug
Mm-hmm.
addiction,
Mm-hmm.
and then oftentimes to a life of petty crime or larger crimes
Mm.
to try to satisfy those addictions, and because they are not as capable of sustaining positive relationships.
Mm, mhm.
So,
And do we have the evidence to know whether that is all to do with the effect of the sentience of the fetus in sort of gestation, or whether it's to do with the lifestyle factors that then happen post birth? Do we have that data?
it seems to be, it starts in the womb, and there is a large study that followed children whose parents had tried to get an abortion for them. This was a European multi country study. And so they had parents who would come in and usually were told it was too late to get an abortion or was for some other reason medically unfeasible. But these were children that had not been wanted prior to birth. Now, of course, after they're born, if they haven't been wanted, then definitely they grow up in different circumstances
Yeah.
than children who were wanted.
Mm,
But these children were compared to controls who were born in the same hospitals on the same days that
mm,
these children, but whose parents had not tried to have the children aborted. And they
mm.
were the ones they were followed for 20 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And these were the ones that I was talking about that had the
Mhm.
higher crime rates and higher everything else.
Mm,
Um, Many children who um, don't know, well, usually were never told that they weren't wanted,
mhm,
um, can replicate exactly the kind of abortion attempt that they had. An early study, you could never do this now, this
mm,
was done in the 1960s, was actually sort of discovered by accident. There were a group of teenage girls who had been institutionalized for repeated suicide attempts.
mhm,
And one of the psychologists or psychiatrists working with him discovered that their suicides, each girl's tended to be around a certain date every year, different dates for different girls. And when they were trying to understand, well, why did these suicides for this one cluster around the first week of October, and for that one, the third week in April, or whatever, they went back and tried to take much more comprehensive histories with the parents. And the mothers finally disclosed something that oftentimes their husbands were not aware of, or the girls'
mm,
fathers were not aware of. So they had attempted on that date to abort the child, and the
mm.
abortion had not been successful.
Huh.
So these girls were reenacting an early suicide that they remembered, regardless of how they had been brought up in the home. And another study showed that the method of suicide replicated, not necessarily type of abortion, but birth difficulty that people had. Suicides that involved forms of asphyxiation, like sticking your head in a gas oven or hanging yourself, that those suicides replicated being born with a cord wrapped around the neck, being strangled
Mm,
at birth,
mm.
that mechanical means, shooting yourself or throwing yourself out of a window, replicated difficult forceps deliveries. So
Wow.
these were people who had been maybe wanted, but it had violence associated with their perinatal experience that
Mhm.
carried on. And this was a controlled study. They were compared with all suicides. And this birth conditions seem to explain a fairly large proportion of suicide method chosen.
That's compelling data to suggest the sentience of fetuses. That's remarkable. And so, what is it that is? How do we know how early in conception the consciousness is developed? Can we work that out from the gestational
Well,
stages?
in regression studies, when adults have been regressed hypnotically, first of all, they can replicate very early movements that are almost impossible for adults to replicate because you know how babies kind of flail
Right.
around at their young age, and they just move differently than adults.
Mm,
Adults, when they are regressed, can recapitulate like all of their movements going through the birth canal. But earlier than that, they can recapitulate their positioning in the womb and being repositioned. They can remember back many, the most common memories that people can report from a prenatal period are conception, the circumstances of conception,
Mm.
are when the woman discovers she's pregnant, when she announces the pregnancy to her
Mhm.
partner,
Mhm.
and oftentimes, if there is interest or concern about the sex of the child,
Mm.
information about that,
Mm.
or other large traumas that may happen.
Mm.
If the mother experienced an earthquake, for
Mm.
example, or even a scary kitchen fire.
Mm.
When when adults are regressed, they can tell these stories, oftentimes stories that the parents have completely forgotten.
Forgotten. Mm.
Um, and they can describe great detail. One man had gotten stuck in the birth canal,
Mm.
and he was seeing a therapist who regressed him, and the man's regression memories contradicted his conscious ideas about his family constellation. He believed that his grandfather, his mother's father, had died many years before he was born.
Mm.
And when he did this regression and found himself stuck in the birth canal, he suddenly understood that the grandfather had only died a week before his mother went into labor.
Oh, wow.
And the grandfather's death had been from a very sudden heart attack.
Mm.
Nobody had expected that he would die. When she went into labor, she was terrified that she too was going to have a heart attack and die. And that's when her labor stopped, with
Got
him
it.
stuck in there.
Oh,
But
wow.
he could see uh, his mother talking to her mother after the father died. Both of the women were weeping. The grandmother was wearing a flowered dress that he described. The mother was wearing maternity clothes that, if I remember correctly, were pink and white striped, had a Peter Pan collar and a gray bow at the collar.
Mhm.
And they were sitting in a particular room that he described.
Mm.
And when he got out of the therapy session and asked his mother, "When did your dad die? I thought he died years before I was born." And she said, "No, he only died a week before." And he said, "Well, I saw you and grandma there weeping, and these were the clothes you had on." She remembered that maternity dress. She did not remember what her mother was wearing, but it was confirmed. And there are a lot of other validated memories of things like this. The
And
conception memories, just
yeah.
to hit
Yeah.
your other
Carry
point,
on. Yeah.
the conception memories tend to be when conception occurred under traumatic circumstances,
Right.
a
Mhm.
rape or a near rape. You know, the woman's not interested in sex, her partner forces it on him.
Yeah.
One woman said they were both drunk out of their minds. You know, this was not supposed to happen.
Mhm. Mhm.
And another woman saw her her parents doing it on a couch in a living room
Mm.
while whoever owned the house, I think it was a relative, maybe an aunt, was supposed to be shopping. And the aunt and the girl's mother came home unexpectedly and caught them. And she said, you know, they were terrified. This wasn't supposed to happen,
Mhm.
but that's when I was conceived.
Oh.
Those are those are usually the circumstances
Which
for
seems, I mean,
conception.
how do we explain this? Do we have good explanations? Because obviously, the gentleman who got stuck in the birth canal, didn't have eyes to see the clothes that his mother and grandmother were wearing. And how do we know what's happening?
Well, it's like a lot of other paranormal types of sensory impressions.
Mhm.
Your sense organs can't actually form the perceptions
Mm.
that you have access to. And I believe that all of these phenomena can be explained by some type of non local
Yeah.
consciousness, form of consciousness that is not restricted by the central nervous system or even the larger cellular body. And we
Mm.
don't have good explanations for that now. The whole field of parapsychology has been attempting to come up with explanations
Hmm.
for these kinds of memories, and that includes certainly near-death memories when the
Hmm.
person appears, to all intents and purposes, to be dead, but is still forming impressions of
Mm.
the here and now. I'm not talking about the
Yeah.
otherworldly impressions that can't be validated,
Mm.
but when they can describe, what the cardiac arrest team is doing to try to start their heart, most people
Yeah.
don't know what that procedure is.
Mm.
And these are often lay people with no medical knowledge who can
Hmm.
describe perfectly the interventions that were performed on their bodies while they're, to all intents and purposes, without a heartbeat, uh, without the ability to see. Oftentimes
Right.
they have an ambu bag or
Right.
bandages or other things
Hmm.
obscuring their eyes
Yeah.
and so forth. But they can see the people in the room. They can recall almost verbatim conversations that they heard.
Hmm.
And this even occurs for people who've had their eardrums shattered, in an explosion or something
Right.
like that. So they should not
Hmm.
be able to hear. But they can
Mm.
recall these conversations, including many times the unspoken thoughts of other people that they've
Hmm.
somehow accessed telepathically.
Mm.
So,
Is this field of psychology progressing at all? It feels like it's been around for a long time with, satellite viewing and all that kind of stuff. But it's like, are we any closer to knowing even how to ask the questions, let alone find the answers?
it's been a marginalized part of consciousness because it doesn't fit the conventional scientific paradigm that
Hmm.
says, your brain and your central nervous system, or
Hmm.
now RNA, DNA in the cells
Hmm.
carry memory. We can't yet explain it, and because we can't
Hmm.
explain it, people want to shoot it down,
Right.
and so it takes a lot of courage to do research in these areas, and it's impossible to get grant funding
I
in most of
wondered.
these areas to do research. So the field has, of necessity, grown very slowly.
Hmm.
And many of the people who are in these fields are not necessarily interested in doing research. They're practitioners who just want
Yeah.
to help heal people.
Yeah.
Because, particularly with pre and perinatal damage, the sooner someone is able to resolve those issues, then the healthier and happier life they have. And
Right.
play therapists, for example, who work with very young children,
Hmm.
often find that they have pre and perinatal damage.
Hmm.
And so they take them through play therapy, and children before the age of 5 can still access those memories. They don't have to be regressed or in any kind of
Right.
altered state. They can
Hmm.
just remember those, and they can
Mm.
reenact their birth. They can reenact prenatal dynamics,
Mm.
and with the help of a therapist can resolve those and then go on and live without the neurosis or other pathology that early trauma
Mm.
can create. But
Mhm.
those practitioners are just interested in healing. They're not necessarily interested in running
Manipulation.
studies.
Mm. And I
So,
sort of question
no.
as well, the utility of knowing more about those sorts of things. Whereas I feel like the higher states of consciousness, I think that's somewhere certainly that much more investigation and research is being done. And I'd love to understand what you've done because it's very common. I live in Austin, Texas, so it's very common to hear about higher states of consciousness associated with plant medicines or something that someone's taken. And I'd love to hear your kind of view on other ways to get to these higher states of consciousness. And you mentioned a couple. You mentioned the meditation, and you also mentioned sex, which I'd love to understand some more of what's happening in those states of consciousness.
Um, well, you can certainly take plant medicines or laboratory produced hallucinogens or other psychedelic medicines like MDMA or
Hmm.
ecstasy, which was initially created to use in the therapeutic
Yeah.
situation to help people, and is now being used that way again, as
Hmm.
most of the other scheduled drugs are. So these drugs, clearly alter your neurochemistry to make different ways of perceiving available to
Hmm.
people. But the mind is very plastic, and the techniques that have been developed over centuries in different cultures do the same thing, whether it's martial arts or meditation or tantric sex practices. But they all, those kinds of deliberate practices work without chemicals. So you are changing which parts of the brain are more prominent in your awareness, and that's also what some chemicals do is they shut down the left hemisphere of your neocortex, so sort of silencing the narrative portion of your mind and allowing the right hemisphere and its closer association with the limbic system where emotion is driven um, come to the fore. And so a lot of psychedelics, you are not thinking in narratively, you are thinking in pictures and symbols. And with the sensory distortions, those can have, multiple ways of forming synesthesias,
Yeah.
where a sound tends to have a flavor associated with it or an emotion associated with it. And those happen to a lot of people. Some people are just wired that way anyway. So it's really the ability to access and, in some cases, deliberately manipulate different parts of your neurobiology to bring certain kinds of experiences and perceptions to the fore while muting other ones.
Yeah. Okay. And so what's the tantric sex element of this? Because I know this has been a big part of your kind of research and what you've looked into. And I feel like I did one podcast with somebody who was very au fait with kind of Tantra and the original Tantra. And we didn't really get into the consciousness side of it in this way. So I'd really love to understand, if we can, how that works.
Well, you don't have to be a tantric sex practitioner to have transcendent experiences or ecstatic experiences during sex. This seems to be an innate capability that all human beings have. To like any other innate capability, to a greater or lesser extent. I'm tone deaf, but some people have perfect pitch,
Right.
and there's everybody in between. And that's the same with this kind of sex. It's a potential everybody has.
Okay.
And Tantra has some refined techniques for helping people get access to it in a practiced way. But you don't have to know about that or do that to access these states. And the reason is, when you think about it, sex naturally contains a lot of the practices or behaviors that bring about altered states. Just the way normal walking or running or just dancing and playing have the distilled movements of ballet in all of them. So we can have this natural expression of movement, or you can have this incredibly refined expression of what the body is capable of mechanically. So with sex, when you think about it, it involves rhythmic movement. If you're vocal, it involves rhythmic sound. It involves simultaneously a degree of relaxation and a degree of hyper alertness or focus. And these are all things that, when refined, bring about altered states. Trance dancing produces trance. Think of dervishes, or think of Sufis doing the kind of dancing that they do. It's the same thing. Rhythmic chanting is what people do when they're reciting mantras, when they're chanting, when they're doing certain kinds of prayer, centering prayer in the Christian tradition, for example. So all of these elements that are present in sex are also taken out of a sexual context and refined to bring about altered states in the world's contemplative religions. So sex has got it. And if you sort of do it long enough or do it in a focused enough way, you're bound to bring about these same altered states. And Tantra helps refine that awareness. And with Tantra, it's focused on energy, but it doesn't have to be. You can, and you don't have to be that deliberate about it. You can still bring about these kinds of states very, very easily, comparatively. If you
I love the way you broke that down. Yeah. I just love the way you broke that down to the ingredients. And it's like, sometimes I think we get so caught up with
the complex structures of things, and we don't break it down to the, like, it's got all the component parts. So of course, it feels like we make it a bit more complicated than we need to sometimes. But yeah. And I think that I think there's sometimes intentionality behind things is sometimes lacking. We're so busy, we're so running around in our like daily lives, and everything feels very rushed that sometimes we lose intentionality. And anything can be transformative if we just have intentionality about it.
I would agree. And I think you're touching on how rushed and busy we are, is that many of us don't treat sex as though it has the capacity to be a sacred or maybe secularly transcendent experience. And if we open up that space and that time to give ourselves that kind of an opening, those are some of the things that naturally will create this kind of a sexual environment. When I was doing my research and talking to people who I did not talk to people who were tantric practitioners.
Right.
I talked to ordinary people who had these experiences and didn't really know why. And I did ask them, was there anything that you were doing differently or special or that was just going on when you had this experience? And it wasn't like some really exotic list with a lot of it. People said, mainly they just created the space for something to happen. Sometimes they got away, it was at a hotel room or something where, you don't look up over your partner's shoulder and suddenly see a pile of laundry in the corner or something like that. So they had a special space that was open that didn't remind them or didn't distract them in terms of what they were going to do. They allowed plenty of time for sex. So it wasn't, oh, I hope the kids don't wake up, or, the mailman's got a special delivery for me from Amazon. I got to, that today. They made space.
Right.
And they dropped in because being aware, being centered, and just focused on what it is you're doing. This is our time to do this. This is what we're going to be doing. And particularly prolonged foreplay was huge. And it's probably one reason that I think this kind of ecstatic sex probably happens more frequently for lesbians than it does for heterosexual couples or even for gay men, because women's same sex tends to involve a lot more foreplay than heterosexual or gay male sex. So a lot of time for foreplay and extended sexual play without worrying about orgasm.
Right.
If you have a goal of orgasm, that's going to be all you're worried about. Forget that. Just enjoy what's going forward. And when you're doing it, being able to be completely absorbed, where you're not thinking about other things, and oftentimes narrowing your awareness to a single stimulus. It may be genital, but it could be something else. It could be just where someone's fingertip is stroking your shoulder or your lips or something like that. And if you can narrow into that, then oftentimes that is the portal to an ecstatic experience.
And I think you're right. I think I have a friend who had kind of like something happen during a sexual encounter, and she was so like she didn't know how to deal with it, because it was like, can this happen? Is this real? Like what actually happened? And it took her a while to integrate and to get back onto like a level playing field in terms of what she could feel and actually to want to have sex again. It was a strange thing. And so it's interesting that there is there's precedent for this. Like, it does happen.
Yes, and I think your friend's reaction is a very normal one. Even when the experience people has is completely positive, it's disrupting because we're not expecting it. Unless you're a tantric or a Taoist sex practitioner, you don't know that these things can happen. Most people in our society don't know that these things can happen. And when it happens, it really can blow you out of the water, because they are just as altered, if you will, or just as away from reality as some psychedelic states or, really advanced spiritual states. And depending on the degree of dislocation in those spheres of reality I was talking about, some people still know that they're in the here and now, but they begin to what they think of as hallucinate. They may see other entities in the room that may seem angelic or demonic or other, other things. But they still know, hey, I'm in this bedroom and I'm just seeing things. And that's kind of, that could be crazy making enough. But for other people, they seem to be transported completely to a different time, a different place. They may seem to have a different body. There are people who have full-blown past life experiences where they suddenly are experiencing themselves, in a different body, in a different time and place, and they don't know what's going on. Other people may find themselves flying out into the universe, like into the stars, passing planets and stuff like that, and be terrified that they can't get back.
Yes.
And other people are still in the here and now, but they're suddenly out of their bodies, looking down at their body and their partners, and they're afraid that they can't get back. Did I die? Is my soul leaving my body? And they panic, but may not be able to get back into their body into that moment. And then other people have experiences that are also completely out of their normal spiritual awareness, that they may be Jewish and have an experience of something that they can only imagine as Jesus or the Holy Ghost. And it's like, what in the world? And because it's so contra their religious upbringing, it can be very disturbing to have those experiences. And that happens. People tend not to have ecstatic experiences that parallel their religious or spiritual beliefs. They often have something that is described in a completely different kind of path.
Interesting. I mean, all of this is
they can be really really disruptive to people. People can be afraid that they're going crazy. They don't understand them, and for some people, these experiences don't involve positive energy. Subconscious dynamics will come up that can be very frightening, and people can see things that scare them. One man that I interviewed saw this, he was a Black man and saw a gigantic, apparently very threatening white man that he thought was about to attack him. And he was terrified of this guy and thought he recognized him from real life. He thought this was a man he had passed in the street. And the guy didn't touch him, but came up to him and said something like, "You think you can handle it?" in a threatening manner. "You think you can handle it?" And the guy was just terrified and ended the sexual contact that he was having to try to make this vision go away. But it kept, coming back to him in his awareness. He kept wondering, what was that? What was that? What was that? And he finally, after a while, actually did see the man that his vision resembled on the street, and he crossed the street. He was too afraid to get close to him. But in some later sexual encounter, the guy came up again, and this time said the same thing, but not in a threatening way. It's more like, "Can you handle it? Can you handle it?" And the man that I was interviewing decided finally this was a message to him from the universe, or I thought maybe from his subconscious, saying, "You are more capable than you think. Stop being so afraid. You really have a lot more capacity than you believe." And in fact, that was where he had come to. He said, "This was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though it started out seeming frightening." But those frightening ones really can cause problems for people.
Yeah, and I imagine some kind of it's almost sexual trauma, because it's like it's now associated with the act of having sex. So it kind of causes this weird, even though, I mean, I don't know what your view is, but I like the thought that it's something from the subconscious that needs to be processed, that you're allowed to access because your chemistry is in a different state. But it's like the universe could pick its timing a little better sometimes.
Yes, it could. And there are some things that I think are not as easy to process. There
Mm.
are a couple people who got so blown open. One of the most common sexual altered states is a form of merging with your partner.
Yeah.
So that you're still in the here and now,
Mm.
but you lose track of agency. Am I
Mhm.
moving that leg? Am I moving my arm?
Right.
Where you just seem to completely meld with your partner. So you're not sure who's doing what to whom, and you don't even feel like separate people.
Yeah.
That's extremely common. And for some people, it goes farther in that they can't get their boundaries back
Yeah.
after the sexual encounter is over. And
Mhm.
their ego boundaries have really been broken open. Oftentimes, they are merged with the partner in an ongoing way. And
Mm.
one man that I spoke to had that happen
Mm.
to the extent that he was having to avoid having sex with his partner. He loved the intimacy and the sex and felt really close to her, but he was having physical symptoms that she had. She had a
Oh,
lot
wow.
of anxiety associated with her family, and he was beginning to have the same kind of stomach problems that she was
Oh,
having. She would get a cold, and he wouldn't even know it, but he would get a cold. And uh, he was in a very intense financial advising business with clients.
Mm.
After he'd been broken open sexually, he found that he was starting to merge with certain of his clients and
Oh.
was not able to get back from that.
Hmm.
So he changed his career to where he just taught finance at a university. So he would just stand and lecture up in the front of the room. But he was beginning to have problems with that, keeping the students at a sufficient distance from him. And at the time that I spoke to him, he had been celibate for 2 years. He
Mm.
was too afraid to open himself, and he was disturbed about how he was having to reconfigure his life
Mm.
because he couldn't regain his ego boundaries.
Mm. Wow.
And that probably stemmed from some early pre and perinatal damage.
Right.
But I was a researcher. I couldn't really talk to him in
Yeah, you can't sort of like say.
about what to do or where to get therapeutic help for that.
Mm.
But
Mm.
yeah, it's not all a bed of roses. So
No.
you have to be
And
careful about these things.
yeah,
Just
but
as you
I'm
have to be careful with
fascinated.
antibiotics. Yeah.
Yeah, well, so true. Yeah, absolutely. And the more I have conversations like this with people like yourself, the more impressed I am with humanness. Like it's just this whole system, it's like it's so complex and so capable of asking for healing, actually, is what I hear from these stories. It's like this stuff comes up in moments where your guard is down, essentially, so that you can do the work to support the healing and the resolution of, in this case, it seems like early boundary rupture stuff and merging. So this is somehow a strange way to get to therapy, but like, I guess it works.
Yeah, it is a strange way, and many of the people I talked to had been able to integrate their experiences, even though
Yeah,
they were maybe very large and disruptive
yeah,
initially. But that may just be an artifact of my research. It may be that people who were damaged or traumatized and had not been able to integrate or resolve their experiences were not volunteering
right,
for this kind of a study. So
right.
it's quite possible that that is underreported.
Right,
But I
because I
was
imagine that there's shame around it as well, quite a lot of shame. I should, just is me just imagining, but there could be.
shame and discomfort with the intensity of the experience.
Right.
One of the saddest things that I uncovered was that about 90% of my sample people had never even told their partners that they were having these experiences during sex.
Mm, wow.
And when I asked why, most of them said, "This is the first time I've ever talked about it." And I said, "So your partner didn't know, didn't notice that you were maybe more abstracted while you were having sex?"
Mhm.
And they said, "No, didn't notice, and I wouldn't tell him." And when I inquired about that, it was the same reason I think that most people don't talk about um, spiritual experiences or really profound. If you have a really profound experience on drugs, it's like that's kind of okay to talk
Yeah.
about, at least in certain circles.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a spiritual experience, if you thought you saw God, or if you had a big revelation,
Mm.
or you hallucinated without drugs, and most people have both shame and privacy about it. I don't
Mm.
want to tell people I had this profound experience that has changed my life,
Yeah.
because they don't want the other people to make fun of it or belittle it, which we often do with people's
Right.
profound religious or spiritual experiences.
Right.
And
Right.
that's why most near-death experiencers didn't talk about their experience until it had made so much press that it was so, fairly accepted to talk about things like that. And there's still plenty of NDEers who don't talk about those experiences because
Mm.
it's too close to us. It's too intimate. It's too
Yeah.
personal, and it's meaningful. And we don't want somebody else to make fun of us or mock
Right.
us.
Yeah. Or take it away, damage the meaning somehow. So yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. I'm desperate to ask, how did you get from all of this to, what did you say? The astronomical, like, tell me the sentence. Like, how, where, like, like, where, like, where did we
That's
get to?
not connected to this kind of study.
Okay. I wondered, like, are these linked, or is this just another one of your
No,
passions?
that is a completely different study. And I mean, I'm certainly happy to talk about that if you want. But,
I love it. You dropped it as a teaser, and I know that my audience, they are very attentive to detail, and they'll be like, "What was the other thing?" So I'd love for you to just speak to it.
I've always been interested in the Northern European pagan literature, whether it was Beowulf or the Poetic Edda or the Prose Edda, which is what we really know all the Norse mythology of Thor, Freya, Odin from. And it was a very powerful spiritual system, particularly around the worship of Thor, even after really aggressive missionary efforts that involved mass executions. Charlemagne's troops committed genocide, really, on pagan priests, and genocide, forced relocation of populations, confiscating all their goods, all kinds of punishments. Thor worship in particular was very, very difficult to stamp out. And you have these missionaries complaining that people still observed Thursday, Thor's Day, as a holy day, even while they were going to Christian churches, where they still wore Thor amulets and prayed to Thor and so forth. And I was curious about what was so compelling, because today, when we read these works, they have a lot of charm and attraction for people, but as spiritual texts, they're not very compelling. Half the stories about Thor, he's sort of a lovable thug. He's somewhat dim-witted compared to Odin. Odin is very treacherous. So why would people would they martyr themselves to hold on to these religions that aren't really not compelling emotionally to us today, or don't seem to suggest a higher type of spirituality? So that was part of what got me very curious. And in looking at these, and it's too long a story for today, but with the help of a guy who was incarcerated in a Texas prison for murder, who had some access to some past life memories as a shaman in 5th century Sweden. I can be actually fairly specific about that. He gave the key to interpreting these stories through the stars and the movements of certain stars. And actually, when you understand the movement of these stars and how certain constellations that we still observe in the northern hemisphere sky coincide with these myths, and how some of the wording in the myths is code for certain stars and certain constellations, the myths suddenly have a whole dimension of meaning that has been obscured, or you don't understand if you just read them at the superficial level. They are funny stories or folk tales, but actually they have a very profound meaning tied to the bringing of light to the world, the advancing of the seasons, which certainly makes sense in higher latitudes when the changes in the sun and warmth and the animal and plant life are much more exaggerated than they are closer to the equator. But there's a lot of speculation now that many of those northern myths are closely related to some of the early Indic myths, maybe part of an Indo-European tradition that migrated from India across the Near East, up through Greece into Europe, and then Northern Europe and Iceland.
So, wow. I mean, that is fascinating. I read the sentence in your bio, and so I kind of knew two of the strands, but I couldn't tie it together in my brain, and I obviously didn't know the link between the kind of the coded text, and I would be fascinated by that too, and that makes sense now why you've gone from deep consciousness research into astronomy.
I'm certainly not an astronomer, but we see traces of this actually not just in the Norse myths, but also you can see remnants of it in some of the Celtic traditions, whether it's, and I'm not restricting that to Ireland or someplace, also a little of what's left in France. But most of these traditions were oral, and they were almost completely wiped out when the culture carriers were killed or died. But we can see it in a lot of the Greek myths. There is still the same symbols are used, and even in the Book of Genesis, there is some of that, as well as in some of these in early Indic myths that relate to the stars. Wow. So, yeah. So it could potentially open windows on a lot of the old pagan religions and help us understand them in a different way, and why they were so compelling to people, to make them willing to withstand persecution, to hold on to these beliefs.
Yeah. And so are you writing a book? What's the outcome
of this? I'm working on a book on this.
This is
it's too complex to do in a series of published articles. So,
yes. Oh, that's so cool. I'm gonna have to look out for this, because this sort of stuff fascinates me, this whole thing. And obviously being from the UK, and actually my family live on a very remote Scottish island, so Norse and Vikings are kind of all around there. So it's not very far away from my life. So yeah. So is that your big project for now? Is that what your main focus is, or
it's part of what I'm working on now. I just published another 2 articles on prenatal consciousness, and some more articles on battle trance, because that's really overlooked. And I'm going to be speaking at a conference in the Republic of Georgia this summer on battle trance. And
interesting.
That part of human potential that has also not been explored, for really extraordinary physical capabilities.
Yeah, and we've run a little long today, so I'm not going to get a chance to go into it either, which is I've overlooked the thing, but we will link to any of those articles that you've just mentioned in the show notes, so that my listeners can go and jump off and find these things. And I think I love the fact that you've explained it as a potential resource of tapping into that physical potential, because from just the tidbits that you've dropped, it feels like it could be seen as a state of consciousness that's specific to being in battle, but actually having it as a trainable potential sounds an intriguing element of this.
Yes, and most of the martial arts actually help support this kind of awareness, and it's used, for example, in certain spiritual traditions to demonstrate spiritual attainment, the ability to be pierced with blades or glass or something like that and not bleed, not become infected. And of course, this has huge health potential for people who are going to undergo some kind of surgery.
Wow, fascinating. Well, I shall link to everything in the show notes and make sure that our listeners can go and bounce off and find the resources themselves. I've really enjoyed chatting to you today. Is there anything else that you need to leave our listeners with, just as a kind of final taster of anything that you would like to share?
I think just that, as you said, human beings and humanness are incredibly fascinating um, ways of being and have so much more potential than I think we've been able to realize in
Mm-hmm.
the relatively short time humans have been on the planet. But
Mm-hmm.
there is so much more that I think we have to go. It's a never ending journey.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. And I will ensure that everyone knows where to find you. Thank you, Jenny.
Very happy to do it, Victoria. Thanks.
Wasn't that fascinating? I hope that you understood from that interview how fascinated and interested I was in what Jenny was discussing. I have linked to everything that you need to dive further into all of the things we discussed in today's show notes. This is really one where you want to go and find those additional resources, everyone. So thank you very much for joining myself and Jenny on today's episode of the Unveiled podcast, and I will see you next week.